Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of the Texas SignalCast. I'm your host, Joe Deshotel, and I'm here with my co-host, Jessica Montoya-Coggins.
Hey y'all.
And we are here to talk about what's going on in Texas politics. A lot going on this week as well. The legislature's still fired up, doing their thing. A couple of progress being made on some high profile stuff. We've got new entrants into the race for Texas governor. We got some new polls coming out about how Texans feel about the budget and guns and a number of other issues. It was 420. That was a big week for Texans. And we also have talk of Medicaid expansion, and we have an election going on right now, May 1st. All over the state of Texas, local elections are happening, and there are anti-trans bills, permitless carry, a lot going on this week. Is there anything that you particularly focused on this week, Jessica?
Well, as you said, there is a lot happening at the Capitol, especially. As we're recording, it is currently budget day, so there's a number of things that are happening. This is, I think, my first time being in Texas for this special day, which I know is very frustrating for a lot of people. We did see that the Medicaid expansion did not pass in the House, which was very disappointing. Obviously, Texas leads the country in the number of uninsured. About 1 in 5 Texans doesn't have health insurance. And this is something that I think is also now at the forefront with the Biden administration sort of withdrawing a waiver that was issued. It was called a 1115 Medicaid waiver reimbursement plan for Texas. And there's still that funding still goes until September. So it's not like, all of a sudden Texas won't have this. But it was really issued in a not great way by the Trump administration. It was done without public comment, really obscuring federal transparency laws. And so now it seemed actually like now was the time for Texas to expand Medicaid. And it looked like there was maybe some bipartisan support. State Representative Lyle Larson, a Republican, has been very vocal actually about this. But unfortunately, he does not have many fellow Republicans who feel similarly.
Yeah, that's true. And we saw some real, what we thought was momentum on the Medicaid expansion in Texas, and I was surprised to see some of that. But as you mentioned, it was stalled, and it's you get 140 days the Texas legislature, and it's a lot harder to pass legislation, of course, than it is to prevent legislation from passing. And there's actually been a lot of transparency issues with legislation this session. As a matter of fact, obviously the pandemic had a lot to do with that because people couldn't even like physically enter the building. A lot of people didn't want to come. The building has been empty compared to typical sessions where you have lots of activists coming, and of course every day the session usually is like a different day, highlighting either a certain issue, whether it's education or it could be geographic. A lot of times there'll be like Southeast Texas Day or South Texas Day or Cameron County Day, and really kind of highlight what's special about those places and the issues that they care about. A lot of that stuff is not happening this session, and I feel like these legislators are really taking advantage of that. There's been issues with technology for hearings where we couldn't even watch some of these hearings take place, and some of them were done audio only, which is a problem for a lot of people and problem for transparency and open government. But the other part is too, some of these bills are being not posted timely when things are moving. What happened at that hearing or that committee hearing the day before, and that stuff is taking way longer to post and become public than it should, and that's giving cover to some of the stuff that's actually happening because it's just not it's just kind of in the cover of darkness. And so that is a big problem, I think, for Texans, especially with some of this stuff that's being done. We talked last week about some of the anti-trans bills that were passed, that were being pushed and being opposed by big businesses and in the state of Texas. And we found out, I think maybe yesterday or something, from the chair, Harold Dutton, who's a Democrat from Houston, basically saying he thinks that bill's probably going to die in committee. Now he's the chair, so it's really up to him if it does or not. So it's a pretty strong indication if he says that's going to be the case. I don't know if you saw any of that hearing on any of those bills, but I was able to catch a little bit, and I heard Representative James Tallarico, who's a young representative from Williamson County, give really just kind of dress this guy down, who was, I mean, no pun intended, but like this guy was one from one of these orgs who was just pushing these awful bills and couldn't even come up with a reason for it. Tallarico was questioning him on the purpose behind the bill. What are you trying to accomplish? What's the problem here? The guy really couldn't come up with an answer. And James, Representative Tallarico basically was saying, we're running out of time here in the legislature. We don't have time to kind of sit and debate things that aren't even problems in our state and essentially making new problems. And so it's just, and I just happened to just check in and listen to a minute of that. I don't know if you've been following these closely or not.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's sort of nationally. There is now, I think, a trend where a lot of these anti-trans bills are starting to maybe get defeated in various states. Like you said, and as we talked about last week, a lot of organizations were opposed to these. The NCAA said that they would not be holding championships in states with this type of discrimination. And, that is something that I think member at Chambers of Commerce have noticed. There was a large letter that was sent a few days ago. It had like Hunt Oil signed on to it. So, I mean,
Wow.
when something like that happens, that it is not something that people broadly want in Texas. And to your point, a lot of the Democratic lawmakers have just really just flat out been questioning, why are we even doing this? There's so much more that we should be doing. This is not a problem. And in fact, if this were to pass, you would put Texas in a world of hurt with these businesses and organizations like the NCAA.
Yeah, and it's a big deal. And Republicans have really nationally been on a tear against professional sports. And so, this kind of aligned left to right. But when you mention Hunt, which is a really big, oil and gas company here in Texas, I think those are the types of businesses that are going to really make a difference in this conversation. And is really going to make them start to question, what they're doing. And we remember last session, it was about bathroom bills. And, that came up in these discussions like, okay, you told us last year that if we didn't pass this, there would be men and women's restrooms and it would just be this huge problem. And there's still to this day, not a problem. So
I will say there was that one case of that U.S. Republican senator. That's the only one I ever know of.
yeah. And that was in an airport, which is actually federally regulated. So they should definitely take care of their own house first. And so it's interesting because Greg Abbott was with the governor, I believe it's South Dakota. There should only be one Dakota for the record, but Kristi Noem, who vetoed the bill, the anti-trans sports bill in her state, because NCAA basically threatened to not do any events there. Now, a lot of people said, well, yeah, but it's, Texas is a much different scenario, a much different, much bigger market. We have the leverage here in Texas. And I think that's true to a degree, but it is showing sort of how this thing is playing out. Same thing was in Arkansas. Their governor, Asa Hutchinson, I think his name is, he also vetoed the bill for the same reasons, and basically saying, well, this goes too far. I think it's interesting on another issue that Noam did sign a bill on, which was permitless carry. And that's another controversial bill that's going through the state legislature right now, where all the headlines have sort of been that Greg Abbott is essentially, mum and not giving his position on this. So I just kind of wanted to throw this up. A simple Google search will show that the top headlines for the last couple of days in Texas have been that Greg Abbott won't say if he supports the NRA-backed permitless carry bill. The Statesman says Greg Abbott dodges questions on permitless carry. And I think it's really important to note that Greg Abbott actually back in 2014 announced his support by signing a copy of HB 195, which was our old friend Jonathan Stickland. Uh, this was his constitutional carry bill that he put forth back then that activists were pushing. Greg Abbott signed that and basically indicated his support. If this crosses my desk, I'm going to sign it. And then that same year or the following year, Tribune did a poll on constitutional carry, found that only 10% of Texans support it. And so I think that this may be why there's some confusion on why Abbott supports it, because all of a sudden there's been polling on it. It's not that popular. And so he's been, shifty on this issue. And the kind of the same with Dan Patrick, who always has his finger in the air to kind of, to stay ahead of the sort of grassroots conservative movement on these issues. And so I think it's important to show some more recent polling that's been done on this issue. And while constitutional carry wasn't specifically mentioned in this poll, what was mentioned was stricter or less strict gun laws in the state of Texas. And this poll, specifically what we're looking at right now, is how Republicans feel about gun legislation in Texas. And if you see, only 24% of Republicans think that the gun laws should be less strict in the state of Texas. Only 24% of Republicans support less strict gun laws. So obviously you have to put constitutional carry in that category. 43% of Republicans think the gun laws in the state of Texas are fine the way they are. And actually, I'll say a whopping 24% of Republicans think gun laws should actually be more strict in the state of Texas. And then when it comes to background checks, 41% of Republicans strongly support background checks on all gun purchases. Another additional 27% are somewhat supportive of background checks on all gun purchases. Altogether, that's almost 70% of Republicans. And so, when we see Dan Patrick, who's now saying, I will move that bill if it comes up for a vote or if it has the votes. And right now he's saying that unequivocally constitutional carry, permitless carry does not have the votes in the Senate to come up for a vote. And you probably know this, but for listeners out there, the lieutenant governor is the president of the Senate. He sets basically the agenda. And there's a very different culture in the Senate than in the House. And so, whereas the House likes to put things up for vote, to call people out and show who's where, the Senate is different. In the Senate, a lot of times they protect each other. And so, it seems that Patrick is protecting whoever the one or two Republicans are, most likely only one or two, that are keeping this from coming up to a vote. And so that's an interesting thing. I've heard conflicting reasons for why he might be doing that. I'm hearing that it's because simply he likes to be super partisan, and if he were to expose that it's bipartisan support against this, that would actually make him look bad. And the other thing could simply be that it's unpopular, and he sees that and doesn't want that to come up in next election cycle. So I don't know if you've been watching this issue closely, or if you have any thoughts on all this, but I found it pretty interesting, these polls.
Yeah, well, it is always fascinating when Abbott doesn't really say something also, because he does tend to speak his mind pretty freely. And as we've just gone through, there is this polling that really indicates that there's not a lot of favor for this permitless carry. And talking about the NRA, they're not the entity that they used to be. They're currently actually up in a bankruptcy hearing here in North Dallas, facing some really dire situations. And I think also it's very heartbreaking around the country as places start to open up again. You are starting to see the number of mass shootings increase. Those tended to go away last year. And that was really only the cause of a nationwide pandemic or global pandemic. And so that's That's, I think, a lot of activists that were down at the Capitol from groups like Moms Demand, they were very, very vocal, and I, applaud everyone who made that trek. And yeah, it doesn't seem like there's a huge fervor for this, even amongst Republicans.
So there is a set of Republicans that obviously do support this in the grassroots, and one of them is Chad Prather. And I don't know if you've ever heard of this guy, but he's a comedian. You know, He's a talk show host on the conservative site Blaze, which was started by Glenn Beck, another person who moved to Texas. I'll say. I don't really want to call him a Texan, but he is a Texas resident. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Blaze. It seemed like it was popular when it first started, and I feel like it's kind of faded into the background a little bit, but maybe it's big on Parler. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think I remember when Glenn Beck started it, and then I think that's where Tommy, and I can't even
Oh,
remember.
Lauren, yeah, Tommy Lauren.
Yeah, I think that's where she got her start. But yeah, I've seen this Chad. The way he's kind of a comedian in the way, like, I consider myself an athlete, even though I'm like really
Right,
not.
yeah.
But yeah, so it sounds like he is throwing his hat in the ring for governor.
Yeah, 100% Chad. Absolutely. So he is, he's kind of taken this approach that Abbott is, basically made freedom hard in Texas, and we need to, you know, I like some of the stuff that he says, because I like anytime these conservatives attack each other, and they're so much better at it than we are. It's really funny, but like, he's, I kind of read his website, and he's talking about like, how can Abbott represent us? He's got $40 million in the bank. The people I want to represent don't have millions of dollars. I don't have millions of dollars. How can somebody like that with, these deep pocketed friends who are the establishment, big business types, how can they represent, the average Texan and all this stuff, which is true. And we could be saying some of the same things about Greg Abbott, and I think we probably will. But it seems like they are picking up on this sense that Greg Abbott is quite vulnerable. And we saw somebody else's name pop up again in this conversation, Matthew McConaughey. A recent poll showed, just like last week, Dallas Morning News, I believe, headlined that McConaughey is up on Greg Abbott by 12 points in this poll. And a lot of people are trying to dissect what that actually means.
Right. Yeah. So that I know it was kind of like with registered voters, if memory serves. But yeah, it made a lot of headlines when that happened. Now, again, Matthew McConaughey hasn't said definitively whether or not he is running. He said it is under consideration. I'm actually sort of midway through his memoir, Green Lights, which is not, since I read The Sound and the Fury have I had to just like stop reading and then just wait a day, because it's a little difficult to get through. I'm not going to lie. And again, you're not going to find any political ideology really from him. And that's, I think, also stuff that people have pointed out, that he is a bit of an empty vessel when it comes to that. But, look, he is very famous, and that has a cachet. I was just, thinking about like all the movies that I've seen, and he's also a philanthropist. He and his wife had a big fundraiser after the winter storm, and he does have this memoir that's taken him really around the country. Pretty much we could probably ask him. He probably appear on our podcast. Like he'll do anything, it sounds like. So maybe.
I actually did think about that. Actually, I was like, why haven't we just reached out to him to talk to him about it? Yeah, I mean, he's actually gotten some criticism from, I'll say, from the left for some of the places where he's appeared. Joe Rogan is one of the most obvious ones. Joe Rogan also now, from California to Texas, here in Austin now, one of the most popular podcasts ever. And he appeared there. And, it's I don't think people really care about Joe Rogan as much, but he gives platform to people with crazy ideas and conspiracies, and then gives platforms to people like McConaughey, who actually has a legitimate reach And so the kind of intermingling of that, I think people have a lot of problems with, because it's like one day you're interviewing somebody like McConaughey, and the next you're interviewing, somebody with like really radical and crazy ideas, like Alex Jones, for instance, who's appeared on his podcast. And so, that is, that's one of them. He's appeared with some other folks. I don't want to say and be wrong, but I was trying to remember one of the other folks that was pretty right wing. It's been some right wing folks that he's kind of commingled with a little bit, but that's sort of been the brand that we've seen from him, is that he is like, well, I think we should be talking to everybody, and the problem is we don't talk to each other. And so I haven't read the book, and I know you're making your way through it, but I would imagine it to be sort of just a book full of metaphors and sort of,
it's a little,
that's how he speaks.
There's also a lot of it. There's a lot of like personal information too. So you find out things that I didn't know, but then also sometimes like, maybe I didn't need to know this. And by the way, when I compared it to Sound and the Fury, I'm not saying that Matthew McConaughey is the Ken William Faulkner. It's just books that frustrated me. Right. But one interesting thing I did find out, and I didn't know this about him, he was very nearly in Titanic. He as in the role that Leonardo DiCaprio ultimately did.
Oh my God.
He was the studio's choice. And then I guess James Cameron kind of was like, I think I'm gonna have to go with this other actor. But
he sunk that idea. Yeah.
There was a point where some parallel universe where he was in Titanic.
That's pretty hilarious. Well, I did see a recent video that he posted 2 days ago on 420. I don't know if you saw this, but it was him and Snoop Dogg, and they were like doing a duet. And so I thought that was kind of funny, because I was actually going to his feed actually specifically to see if he said anything about the poll. I assumed that he probably didn't, but if you look at his feed, you would have no idea there was a poll that showed him up 12 points over the incumbent governor. But he did have the duet with Snoop Dogg. And so I thought that was pretty funny. And and then, it's 420. We have to talk about Willie Nelson. So I don't know if you saw, but Willie Nelson made this appeal to Joe Biden about a holiday, which you call it a high holiday, I think. I don't know why he didn't just say holiday. Well, that kind of sounds weird, but when I say it, so between 420, April 20th, and his birthday, which is like 10 days after 420, that he wants it to be like this week-long holiday of, I guess, smoking weed. But, he's done a lot.
I would expect nothing less from Willie Nelson, but
right.
Yeah, we will see on a federal level if that ever comes to fruition. Biden is oddly, I think, out of step with a lot of national Democrats on that issue. But here in Texas, I know there's been several bills that were filed on April 20th. Jasmine Crockett, who we've talked with a fair number of times, she filed a bunch. Her social media feed was very, very cute, the way she was sort of phrasing everything to have sort of the pot theme. But And Texas is very much behind in states when it comes to this, and it is something that I think we're getting ready to see some numbers here, pretty broadly popular.
Yeah, I mean, the latest that I've seen is this is a 2021 poll, so this is recent. 64% of Texans support legalization, 50% of Republicans, 75% of Democrats, and 71% of independents. And like I mentioned before we started recording, I always love to see that in these polls, the independent number is always much closer to the Democrats than it is to Republicans. And I sat in on a briefing about some polling that was done on independents in Texas recently. Hasn't really been released, but hopefully we'll get our hands on that and we could do a whole podcast on that because it's super interesting. But there's a huge gap. What independents will say when you talk to them about Democrats versus Republicans and issues, they in their minds align themselves more with Republicans because Republicans are in charge, they're running the state, Texas is successful. So they kind of Republicans get the benefit of the doubt for being successful or for Texas's success. Mm-hmm. When, as we talk about week after week, Texas is successful in spite of Republicans and despite everything that they do and all of the economic hurdles that they actually put into place for average everyday Texans, and then even big business that can't stand some of the things they're trying to do. So, and I think this is why the Texas Signal is so important as an institution, is to help close that gap between how independents think of themselves and see Texas, and then the actual Democratic Party and its brand and the issues that we represent and support, versus what Republicans might say, do, or say we support or do. But I think this is one of those that it's a clear opportunity for Democrats to get out ahead of and show their support. And of course, we saw that, as you mentioned, Jasmine Crockett, a new representative, but we also saw, it was up here a second ago, James Tallarico, who we mentioned earlier. I guess I need to start a James Tallarico fan club. Maybe, I don't know if we're going to keep talking about him, but he did post his 420 post where he's showing the bill that he actually wrote that would not just legalize cannabis, but do the other really important work, which is expunge past convictions of marijuana and use that tax revenue to fund early childhood education. And so I think that's kind of a good jumping point to kind of talk about how Texans in general feel about the budget. It's really interesting because if you look at what Texans think about the budget, even Republicans think that there's a lot of areas where we're just not spending enough money. Mental health services is one of them. 60% almost of Texans think that we should be spending more on mental health services and education. And so 49% think we don't spend enough money on healthcare coverage. And that's compared to only 15% who think we do spend too much on healthcare. So really, again, like, if you take the branding away and you just look at the issues, Democrats should be winning the state of Texas on the issues. So you got to kind of ask the question of like, well, what's really the problem here? And I think it's infrastructure. It's all the things we're seeing Republicans do to prevent Democrats from coming out to the polls and voting. It's and it's branding, which is something that we need to look at internally. I don't know if you had a chance to kind of look at these numbers on the screen here, but I don't know if anything is like kind of like sticking out to you. But if you look at, even the prisons issue and without, kind of broadly criminal justice reform, only 17% of Texans think we don't spend enough on that. Mm-hmm. And so when you think about, marijuana legalization, you're not just going to have a popular, issue there, but you're also going to reduce the amount of money you're overall spending on things like prisons and criminal justice system. And, I think that's one thing that we could start to kind of tie those things together.
The mental health services, I think, makes sense, especially when you think about this past year and what it was, just extraordinarily trying for so many folks. So that, I think, in many ways, it's been surprising. The border security number actually was a little lower than I even thought too, where we've, heard so much about that. So that's interesting as well.
Yeah, I agree. The 39% of Texans who think we spend too little on border security is surprising.
Yeah, I would have thought that would have been higher.
Yeah, and clearly driven by the Republicans. If you look at this next set of polls, this is broken up by Republican versus Democrat, and you see that when you ask the Republicans about border security, 61%. And really, I've been tracking these polls for years. The Texas Politics Project, which is University of Texas and the Texas Tribune partnership, I think. Border security has always been the number one issue. As a matter of fact, the second issue is immigration when you ask Republicans. So border security and immigration as two separate issues are number one and number two for Republicans in the state of Texas. So the fact that it's only down now to 61% is the most important. And then mental health funding at 44%. There's some changes going on, and they're favorable to the Democrats. Because even as we see now, and I think we'll talk a little bit about this later maybe, but the homelessness issue, which is a big deal, the governor has come down on Austin about for decriminalizing homelessness. If you kind of take that homelessness issue and break it up into different pieces, we win on those issues because a lot of what we find is their mental health and substance abuse issues are tied to homelessness in a strong way. There are positive correlations there. So if you look at it, Texans are saying we don't spend enough on mental health services. And then, you know, so if you look at, what the priorities are for Texans, healthcare and mental health services, we should be spending the money there. You look at the gun issue where Texans don't want to see more lax gun laws. But then when we do see a mass shooting, what's the first thing Republicans do after they say thoughts and prayers? They say, well, this is a mental health issue. And if it's a mental health issue, then you have to ask who's in charge of the budget. And the answer is Republicans. Why aren't Republicans spending more on mental health services? Why is it only a mental health issue when somebody shoots up a school, but then they actually don't do anything about even the mental health or healthcare aspect of the issue? So I really think that if we can kind of start picking these things apart, educating people, and it's a long game, but once you get below the surface, there's a lot to be optimistic about for Democrats in these polls, I think.
Yeah, no, clearly. And there's a bunch of issues here that these are our strengths, and this is what we
Mm-hmm.
have as a party. So yes, this is consultants. If you're out there, this is take a look at all this.
Yeah, and we already know that Hispanics and Blacks tend to align better with the Democratic Party, but this next set of polls, which is sort of the same question, but broken down by ethnicity and race, just really make that even more clear. Healthcare coverage is the biggest issue for Hispanic Texans, and we have the highest uninsured rate of children. And as we spoke about earlier, you were saying that Medicaid expansion failed in Texas. So I'm thinking, looking at this, if you talk to Hispanics about the budget in the state of Texas in the legislature, they failed because they didn't even address the number one issue, which is healthcare. What's the second biggest issue? Mental health services. So again, just going down the line, response to the coronavirus pandemic, you know, there was push to do something with that at the legislature that also failed. And so, and if you look at African American, the issues that they care about, mental health services is number one. And then education is number two, and then healthcare coverage at 61%. So really, yeah, again, over and over again, we're aligning with this, with where Texans are. And so the rest of this poll kind of breaks things down, more granularly by issue. And so that's pretty interesting. So I would suggest, folks, they want to see more on this, that they actually go to texaspolitics.utexas.edu or just search for the latest Texas Politics Project polling. And it's very interesting stuff. I think I really encourage, folks who are organizers or activist community or just care about the community to really take a look at these polls and understand how we should be talking to different communities about different issues. Really kind of fascinating stuff there. And so, that kind of brings us to the issues that are on the ballot right now, all over the state of Texas. There are issues, local candidates running for office. I know we talked last time about some of the candidates you had spoken to for local office. And recently, one of the podcasts, I don't know if it was yours, we interviewed somebody for run for.
Yeah, I talked with Ross Morales-Raqueto from Run for Something. Interesting,
Yeah.
he also brought up Representative James Tallarico, a former Run for Something candidate. So it's just synchronicity everywhere for the podcast. But we chatted about their organization. They have a lot of candidates that they have endorsed on the city council races, school board races. That's really what they do. And throughout the state, early voting has begun. I myself am probably going to go vote tomorrow. And there's also local ordinances. We had a story out about Lubbock, which is voting on a proposition to make their city a sanctuary city for the unborn. If that sounds
very strange to you, you're not alone. It was actually defeated in their city council last year, but then sort of the right-wing activists were able to get enough petition signees to take that to a ballot measure. But yeah, so that is something that is happening in Lubbock. There's been 22 other smaller cities around the country that have done that, but Lubbock would be by far the largest, and actually the only city with abortion services happening where
and an actual clinic. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so I was looking at the voter turnout. Seems to be a bit high there happening right now, but it's also higher in Texas as well, or excuse me, in Austin as well, where there are a lot of ballot initiatives in Austin, and a couple of them that, and I talked in depth about this. I had a whole podcast about it earlier this week. Basically making the point that what happens in Austin, and this is actually the motto of the University of Texas, what happens here changes the world. But in Austin, we know over and over, things that originate in Austin City Council end up at the legislative level. A lot of the times it happened with a policing issue this session. It's happening with the homelessness issue this session. And that has a statewide impact. So that's why I was just kind of dialing in on what was actually going on in Austin to give a preview, because a lot of the things they're trying to push in Austin right now. And for transparency, I'm on the leadership council for Austinites for Progressive Reform, but there are Democratic reforms that are being pushed, things like instant runoff, democracy dollars, which would give small amounts of money to register voters to give towards local candidates of their choice. This is sort of, baby steps towards publicly funded elections. It's also something that we are piloting based on what's going on in Seattle, where we've seen the result of these things is that you just see more people of color running for office because they have a chance, and the ones that are winning are saying those small dollar donations were critical to their winning and having a chance to have a real campaign versus people who are high dollar self-funders and things like that. So super interesting stuff. Really, the exact opposite of what we're seeing going on at the state level. San Antonio also they have a controversial proposition that is dealing with police reform. I don't really know much about the specifics, but I did see that Coach Greg Popovich, who we've thrown his name around a little bit as a potential candidate for governor, also Beto, another person considering, who have come out in support of this as an accountability measure.
Yeah, it concerns the collective bargaining for the police department. If Pop does run for office, he will likely not have the support of the San Antonio police union chief, because he did very much blast Popovich for that. Which is, I think, to be expected.
Yeah, and of course, you see Republicans jumping on this, saying, "Oh, Democrats are trying to fund the police in San Antonio. Like, we got to back the blue." But the fact is, we talked earlier about the constitutional carry bill. Law enforcement does not support that. That makes it harder for them to know, who should be or should not be carrying, and of course, it allows guns in the hands of more people who should not have them, which makes their jobs much more dangerous. And so, it's very convenient when they use law enforcement to push their agenda, but it's not always consistent. And Democrats just don't really do that. We're not. I mean, we may do it in jest and say, "Oh, look, the Republicans are trying to they're not back in the blue or whatever." But we don't. I mean, that's just not something we do. We're not using the police in that way to just as a hammer to bash Republicans over the head necessarily, but we are trying to at least point out the inconsistencies and the fact that they're being quite hypocritical on this issue. Because if they supported the police, they would not even be considering to take away the requirements for training to carry a license or to carry a gun. So, yeah, I don't know of any other off the top of my head controversial things that are going on. I know Dallas and you guys have a couple things on the ballot, but it didn't seem like it was particularly controversial or anything. Um,
No, nothing crazy. There's a couple school board bond proposals that are up, and then we have some city council races that'll be interesting to see. And yeah, that's not all up here. There is a I'm recording from my grandfather's house, and even though he's in Dallas, it's a different school district. So there's a very contentious school board race apparently. So I'll be interested to see
I
who.
mean, those school board races are getting pretty wild. I'm working on a couple of campaigns here and locally at the school board level, and they're getting wild. So I was really glad to hear what you said. Run for something is run for something.
Mhm.
Is really focused on that, because the fact is Republicans basically took over the state of Texas and many other legislatures by starting at the school board level and running people at that level and building a bench. And they just, they rose and rose and rose as they gained clout and experience, and were able to raise money and things like that. So that is exactly what we need to be doing. We focus a lot on the presidential, and then we focus a lot at the statewide level, because it's just certain like indicators of success. But the fact is, the real work at the grassroots level is happening in these really, localized elections. And these are the folks that are the future of our party. And so we really have to start watching that. And I know that, we'll continue to give platform, as you have on your podcast, to folks that are doing that. And, one of the places that we can't overlook is Harris County and what's happening there, what we saw in 2020 election cycle with all the innovative voting, mechanisms that they brought forth, like, in some cases, 24-hour voting, drive-through voting, sending vote by mail applications out to folks. Those are all now targets at the legislature. And the good news is for folks in Harris County today for this May election is they will still be able to utilize those tools and to make voting easy while we still have a pandemic going on. And so the legislature is pushing these. So now it's almost kind of like, Austin was they used to bash Austin. Now they're starting to pay attention to Houston and what's going on in Harris County. We talked about this before with the gerrymandering of the district courts, because they just elected all these young African-American women as judges. And so now naturally the Republicans are all focused on Harris County and like, whoa, man, what's going on there? We got to really, we got to clamp down on all the voting that's going on there. And so, we're seeing now they're starting to kind of take that mantle from Austin and become the new sort of, new target for GOP anti-voting legislation.
And there's been a lot of demonstrations from various organizations. Move Texas has been at the forefront of that. And we've talked about the corporations that are being asked to respond to that. AT&T and Dell have spoken out very forcefully, or excuse me, American Airlines and Dell. AT&T where people are trying to get AT&T to do similar things. So I think that will continue as those two bills sort of make their way through the legislature, and if they do end up at Abbott's desk.
And I'm sure it's, absolutely zero coincidence, but just this week, Houston was named once again America's most diverse city. And as a matter of fact, there were 4 Texas cities that were at the top of that list. So I believe Fort Worth, actually, I think was number 25, believe it or not. You probably do believe it. You're in North Texas, so you know what it looks like up there. But Dallas was ranked number 4th. And Arlington was 8. So DFW really, really carrying its weight, as it were, with the diversity of the state of Texas. And, I'll take that as my sort of good news, sort of light, highlight for this week. We've actually gone a couple weeks without mentioning Ted Cruz, which is, pretty funny, because we used to just talk about him constantly because he was just embarrassing us left and right.
Mm-hmm.
And he continues to, with some of his latest antics. He did a presser just, I think it was this morning or yesterday. And he said basically like, well, you didn't see Republicans, using the Senate as a way to, to rig the game. And it's like, how much time do we spend talking about Merrick Garland and you guys
Yeah.
blocking him
Yeah.
and everything? So he's, conveniently forgotten everything he did to overturn millions of legitimate votes at the Supreme Court, no less, because this presser was about the quote unquote court packing, or court expansion is really what it is. But I don't know. To me, it's always pretty funny just to see how he just sets himself up to be owned so properly on Twitter. That was one of the things. And then the other thing was that on Earth Day, no less, he was saying how the Green New Deal would just be the absolute worst thing for the American, energy economy. And plenty of people were there to remind him about what happened in Texas in February.
I don't know. Maybe he had some frozen margaritas. It fogged his memory on that.
Yeah, froze his brain, huh?
Yeah. But no, yes, we have not talked that much about Ted Cruz. I'm sure that he'll be, I know he was at the forefront of trying to censure Maxine Waters. So I'm sure representative from California, but he'll be there. And it's Oscar weekend coming up, so he always loves to insert himself in Hollywood stuff. So maybe we'll see some tweets about that.
About the liberal elite, huh? In big Hollywood. Yeah. Okay. Well, hey, that's a lot. We covered a lot today. So do you have anything else that we might have left off, or you want to add?
No, just remember, elections happening all across the state. Get out there, go vote.
Yeah, so early voting is through this upcoming Tuesday, the 27th, and election day is Saturday, May the 1st. So you probably have something on your ballot locally. Make sure to go take a look at that at your county elections office online, and get informed. And of course, as always, stay in touch with us at texassignal.com. Check out all our great reporting and keep in touch with us on social media, Texas Signal on Twitter, and pretty much every social media platform that's out there, including TikTok. I've actually started watching our TikToks more. Very cool. Our social media intern, Bella, has been basically given the headlines and letting people know like what's going on at texassignal.com. So, and always a special thanks to our patrons who support us and keep this kind of progressive journalism going so that we can inform Texans of what's really going on in the state of Texas. So with that, we'll see you next week.
Bye, guys.